So this is chapter 18, in which we're going to look at the endocrine system. So before we get started with the endocrine system, let's review intercellular communication and then talk about how the nervous system differs from the endocrine system. So we spent the end of A&P1 and the first two chapters of A&P2 looking at the nervous system, which controls many of the effectors within the body. And so with this chapter, we're going to focus in on the endocrine system after seeing how they're different. So just a reminder, we introduced this concept to you way back in chapter 1, but it's worth it to go ahead and remind you again that everything we're learning about the body is oriented around the idea of homeostasis. And remember that homeostasis is the maintenance of a stable internal environment despite changing conditions. So for example, if it gets really cold outside, we're still able to maintain our normal body temperature. And with intercellular communication, if you think about it, we've got many different cell types throughout the body. We've already talked about several of those throughout A&P1, and we're introducing many new types to you in A&P2. And these different cell types, they have different functions. They're scattered in different organs throughout the body, and they have to be able to communicate in order to coordinate responses in order to maintain an overall state of homeostasis. And so before we get into detail with the endocrine system, let's review the 5 major types of intercellular communication. Remember your root words. Inter means between. So we're talking about communication between cells. So now we'll take a look at the 5 types of intercellular communication, and we'll start with direct communication. So direct communication only occurs if 2 cells are touching each other and they have gap junctions. So they are able to share ions, small solutes, and lipid-soluble materials directly between the cytoplasm. So this is going to be limited to adjacent cells of the same type that have those connexons between them that allow them to have the gap junctions. For example, in cardiac muscle cells. So we don't see too much direct communication, and we mention those in specific chapters when they come up. There is also paracrine communication. This is the release of chemicals called paracrines, but they are only released into the extracellular fluid, so they are only going to diffuse for a short space around the cell that's secreting them. So they're going to be limited to a local area. So only cells that are close to the cell that's releasing the chemical and that also have receptors for that chemical will be affected. So again, this is local only, and we'll mention this in specific chapters throughout the semester when this type of situation arises. There is also autocrine communication, and again, this is chemicals released through extracellular fluid. These are called autocrines, and these chemicals stimulate the cell that releases them. So the cell that releases the molecules also has the receptors for them. So this is self-regulation only. So a cell is releasing something that regulates its own activities. So again, this is kind of specific, and we'll mention this when it arises in different systems. All right, so the more broad types of intercellular communication are these last 2. There is the endocrine communication, in which chemical messengers called hormones are released into the bloodstream. Well, blood goes pretty much everywhere in the body, so these hormones are going to be distributed throughout the entire body, and target cells can be located anywhere else in the body. They can be close by, they can be far away, they can be all over the place. As long as the target cell has a receptor for the specific hormone that is released into the bloodstream, it will be affected. So you get very broad effects, and this is going to be the focus of this chapter. And then synaptic communication, we talked about back in the nervous system chapters. You're releasing a chemical messenger called a neurotransmitter. It's diffusing across a very narrow space called a synapse, where it's going to bind to receptors on the target cell. So that we went over the details of synaptic communications in chapter 12, and then we talked about how the nervous system works through synapses and cells talking to other cells all the way through chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. So if you need to review the nervous system communication, we've already covered that. Now we're going to focus on the endocrine communication, which is sending chemical messengers through the bloodstream. So before we get deep into the endocrine system, let's go over similarities and differences between the endocrine system and the nervous system. So let's first look at some similarities. Both systems use chemical messengers. In the endocrine system, we call them hormones. In the nervous system, we call them neurotransmitters. Both systems use similar types of molecules as these messengers, and in some cases, they even use the same ones. So for example, epinephrine and norepinephrine can function as both a neurotransmitter and a hormone. So if it's released in a synapse, we call it a neurotransmitter. If it's released into the bloodstream, we call it a hormone. So they can be the same chemical. We just use the terminology to indicate where it is released. So again, a neurotransmitter is released into a synapse, and a hormone is released into the bloodstream. They could be the same type of molecule, or in this case, they could be identical molecules. It just depends on where they are released. Both systems also regulate themselves by using negative feedback. And we talked about negative feedback way back in chapter 1. But remember, negative feedback is acting to counteract a stimulus. So for example, if the stimulus is your body is too cold, then you're going to do stuff to warm yourself up, right? So negative feedback is going to be counteracting whatever the stimulus was. Also, both systems work to preserve homeostasis. So they are both methods by which you can have a control system that communicates with cells all over the body to make sure that systems work together to maintain that state of homeostasis. So now let's look at some differences. The target area is different. So with the endocrine system, we have a broad target area. So the hormone is released into the blood, and the hormone can travel to wherever the blood travels, which is pretty much everywhere. So the target area for that chemical is the entire body. Whereas with the nervous system, target areas were specific. So when a neurotransmitter was released by a neuron, it was released into a synapse. So it's only going to affect the cell that's on the other side of the synapse. It's not going to affect cells, elsewhere in the body. But with the endocrine system, because the hormone goes into the blood, it can affect cells anywhere in the body. The time to initiate action is also different. In the endocrine system, you have a slower response. So you have to release the hormone from the endocrine organ. It has to go into the bloodstream. It then has to move throughout the circulatory system to get to the target cells and target organs. It then has to diffuse out of the bloodstream, and then it has to get to those cells and bind to receptors. So it's not going to be a very fast response. With the nervous system, it is a fast response. You've got those really fast action potentials that can travel up to 200 meters per second. And then when the chemicals are released from a synapse, the distance that the chemical has to travel to get to receptors on the other cell is very, very, very small. So the chemical movement across a synapse is very rapid compared to having to wait for a chemical to circulate through the blood. So the endocrine system has a slower response time. The nervous system is faster. Also, the time of the effects, so how long the effects stick around. With the endocrine system, these are long-lasting effects. The hormones can hang around for a long time in the blood and tissues before being degraded. So hormones can have effects that can last for hours to days. Whereas the nervous system effects are very short term. One action potential results in a very brief response, and then that neurotransmitter is cleaned out of the synapse and the response stops. So the only way to keep the response going would be to continue to send signals. So the nervous system is a short-term response. The endocrine system is a long-lasting response. So basically, you can think of the nervous system as best for crisis management. So like you touch a hot stove, you need to jerk your hand away. You're in a dangerous situation where you need to fight or flight. The nervous system is going to be best at handling those emergencies and crisis situations whereas the endocrine system is best for sustained long-term management. For example, maintaining your correct fluid balance in your blood, or your ion management, like your calcium regulation or your sodium regulation. Those are going to be best controlled by the endocrine system and hormones. So now we're going to focus in on the endocrine system, and we're going to start with an overview. So the endocrine system consists of all of the endocrine cells and the organs that contain those cells, and these are cells that are producing hormones that are released into blood or extracellular fluid. Remember, we contrasted endocrine cells with exocrine cells back in chapter 4. An exocrine cell secretes a substance into a duct, but an endocrine cell secretes a substance, now we're calling that substance a hormone, into the blood or extracellular fluid. So we're going to go through quite a few of these organs and hormones in this particular chapter. And then as you can see over here on the left side where it says organs with secondary endocrine functions, we're going to cover these when we get to the respective chapters. So we'll talk about the heart and its hormones when we get to chapter 21. But for now, you should go ahead and learn the names of all of these organs and cell populations that produce hormones. And yes, you do need to know what hormones, major hormones, each one produces. So again, we're going to do a lot of these in detail in this chapter. But as an introduction, the hypothalamus produces antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, and a bunch of different regulatory hormones. The pituitary gland releases the oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone produced by the hypothalamus through the posterior lobe. Then the anterior lobe produces adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, growth hormone, prolactin, follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and melanocyte stimulating hormone. The thyroid gland produces thyroid hormones called thyroxine or T4 and triiodothyronine or T3, as well as calcitonin. The adrenal glands can be divided into two sections. The medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. The cortex produces cortisol, corticosterone, cortisone, aldosterone, and androgens. The endocrine portion of the pancreas produces insulin and glucagon. The pineal gland produces melatonin. The parathyroid glands, which sit behind the thyroid glands, produce parathyroid hormone. Then, as I mentioned, there are several other organs that produce hormones as a secondary function, like the heart produces the atrial natriuretic peptide and the brain natriuretic peptide. The thymus produces thymosins. Adipose tissue, which is your fat tissue, produces leptin. The digestive tract produces numerous hormones that we're not even going to mention until we get to a later chapter. The kidneys produce erythropoietin and calcitriol. Gonads, which are the main sex cell producing areas. The testes in males produces testosterone and inhibin, and the ovaries in females produces estrogens, progesterone, and inhibin. So in this section, we're going to introduce you to the different classes of hormones, talk about how hormones can affect cells in general terms. We'll talk about the two major types of hormone receptors, what the stimuli are for an endocrine cell to secrete hormones, and then how hormones are inactivated. So first, hormones can be divided into three broad classes. The first class of hormones are the amino acid derivatives, also called the biogenic amines. These are hormones that are derived from two amino acids, tyrosine or tryptophan. Some examples of these are your catecholamines, which is like your epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine. You also have your thyroid hormones, like T3 and T4, and you have melatonin. Another class of hormones are called peptide hormones. These are composed of glycoproteins, which if you remember from chapter 3 last semester is a protein with a sugar stuck on it, and small proteins, so just a couple of amino acids that are chained together. Examples of peptide hormones include thyroid stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, antidiuretic hormone, oxytocin, and growth hormone. And the third class of hormones are your lipid derivatives. These are two major classes of lipids. One's called eicosanoids and one's called steroids, but they are both water insoluble. So when they're lipid, that means they are hydrophobic. So these are the ones that would be able to go through the plasma membrane of a cell, because if you remember, the plasma membrane of a cell has that hydrophobic middle that will only allow lipid-soluble materials to pass without a protein carrier or channel. Examples of lipid derivative hormones are prostaglandins, estrogen, and testosterone. So, how does a hormone affect a target cell? First, let me drive home this key principle. Hormones can only affect cells that have a receptor for that hormone. Remember, hormones are released into the bloodstream generally, and the blood goes all over the body. So any cell that comes into contact with blood can come into contact with that hormone. That doesn't mean the hormone is going to affect every cell in the body. In order for the hormone to affect a cell, that cell has to have a receptor for that particular hormone. And another key point that we went over in chapter 3 back in A&P 1 was that receptors are very specific for what can bind to them. So a receptor that binds to epinephrine, for example, is not going to bind to thyroid hormone, right? So each receptor is only going to bind to one type of hormone, and a cell is only going to respond to that hormone if it has that receptor. So one cell in the body can have multiple types of hormone receptors, meaning that it can respond to multiple different types of hormones. But different tissues throughout the body have different combinations of receptors, and this is why your heart is going to respond differently to hormones than your kidneys, for example. So the specific type of receptors found in these different areas is what allows them to respond the way they do to a particular hormone. Cells can also alter their hormone receptors. So in response to a hormone, cells can down-regulate, which means they reduce the number of hormone receptors they have available. This would make the cell less sensitive to that hormone. They can also upregulate, which means they increase the number of hormone receptors they have available for that hormone, which would then make the cell more sensitive to that particular hormone. So when a hormone binds to its receptor on a target cell, and there are two major classes of receptors that we're going to talk about next, but there are several things that happens after the hormone binds to the receptor. And so we're staying very general right now. We'll get into specifics later when we talk about specific hormones, but now we're just talking about general actions caused by hormones. So hormones have the potential to change the genetic activity of a target cell. So remember, genes have all of the information necessary to make proteins, and then proteins do all of the jobs inside of the cell. So by changing that genetic activity, turning on some genes, turning off other genes, the hormone can actually alter the activity of the target cell. It can also alter the rate of protein synthesis by the target cell, so it can tell a target cell to make more of a specific type of protein or less of a specific type of protein. And a hormone can change the membrane permeability of the target cell. So remember, membranes are only permeable to those substances that it has channels and carrier proteins for. So a hormone, for example, could cause a particular target cell to have more channels for a particular ion, which would let it have more of that ion cross over the plasma membrane. So as I mentioned, there are two broad classes of hormone receptors, and I'm not going to go into the level of detail the textbook does in this section, so make sure that you don't study too much when it comes to the hormone actions and their receptors. Only what I cover here is only what I want you to know. So with the plasma membrane receptors, these are going to be receptors for water-soluble hormones. So remember, a water-soluble hormone cannot cross the plasma membrane of a cell, so it has to bind to a receptor that is in the plasma membrane because that hormone can't get inside the cell. So it has to bind to a receptor because the hormone is stuck outside. And this is going to be your amino acid derivative hormones and your peptide hormones. These are your water-soluble hormones. The receptors they bind to are called G protein coupled receptors, because the receptor is also attached to what's called a G protein. So when the hormone binds to the receptor, the hormone is considered to be the first messenger. And when the hormone binds, that is going to activate the G protein. The G protein is then going to activate what we call a second messenger cascade. So basically the first message was the hormone binding to the receptor. The second message is all of this stuff going on inside of the cell. And again, your textbook goes into a lot of detail of these different types of enzymes and what they do. And I would go into that level of detail if this wasn't an intro A&P course or if this was a cell biology course. But as it is, we're just introducing you to these concepts, so I am not going into that level of detail. All you need to know is that the hormone binds to a protein that is bound to a G protein, and the G protein initiates the second messenger cascade inside the cell. And the most common second messengers that then do stuff inside the cells are cyclic AMP, also called CAMP, cyclic GMP, also called CGMP, and then calcium ions. And the reason why this all gets to be really important later on when you get farther and deeper into anatomy and physiology is that about 80% of all of our prescription medications that we take target G protein coupled receptors. So if you're bound for a career in the health sciences, you probably are going to have to learn some specific details to know how certain medications work. And definitely if you're interested in going to pharmacy school, you're going to have to learn a whole lot more about these different types of G protein coupled receptors. So again, this is how water-soluble hormones interact with their receptor, which is a receptor stuck in the plasma membrane. So if you remember, we also had lipid-soluble hormones. Lipid-soluble hormones are going to bind to intracellular receptors. Intra means within, so within the cell. So the receptor is inside the cell. And for these are going to be the receptors for those lipid-soluble hormones like the sex hormones, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone. The receptors are located inside the cell, either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. And the hormone can diffuse right through the plasma membrane because it's lipid soluble and the middle of the plasma membrane is hydrophobic. So these guys are able to pass straight through the plasma membrane. They get inside, they bind to their receptor, and then the receptor hormone complex can then go into the nucleus and change the way that genes are being expressed within that cell. So these are more likely to be the ones that can actually change which genes are turned on or off, so they alter gene activity. Thyroid hormones can also cross the plasma membrane directly and bind to receptors located on mitochondria. So thyroid hormones, as we'll see later, can have a direct effect on ATP production. So if the thyroid hormone is bound to a mitochondria, it can increase the ATP production. They also can alter gene activity as well. So this is the second type of receptor for a hormone called an intracellular receptor, and this is for lipid-soluble hormones. So endocrine cells won't release their hormone until they get a trigger to do so. So there are three main types of triggers or stimuli that cause endocrine cells to release their hormones. The first is a humoral stimuli. So changes in the composition of extracellular fluid can be the stimulus to tell an endocrine cell, okay, now it's time to release the hormone. For example, calcium concentrations in the extracellular fluid can control whether or not the thyroid gland releases calmodulin. Hormonal stimuli is when the arrival or removal of another hormone triggers a endocrine cell to release its hormone. So as we'll see in a bit, the hypothalamus can release hormones that cause the pituitary to then release a different hormone. So that would be a hormonal stimuli. And then there's neural stimuli. So you can actually have a neuron send a signal to an endocrine gland to tell it to secrete a hormone. And we would call these neuroglandular junctions because it's a neuron talking to an endocrine gland. And just as a reminder, because this is worth driving home, cells can only respond to hormones that they have receptors for. So if I have a cell over here, for example, that has only receptors for hormone A, only hormone A is going to affect the cell even if hormone B is around. And if I have a cell over here on the right that only has receptors for hormone B, then only hormone B is going to affect the cell even if hormone A is around. But somewhere else in the body, I may have a cell that has both receptors, one for hormone A and one for hormone B, and it can be affected by both hormones. So cells can only respond to hormones that they have receptors for either in their plasma membrane or inside their cytoplasm and nucleus. So hormones travel through the bloodstream to all areas of the body, as we've mentioned before. Note that when hormones are traveling through the blood, they can be either in a free form, which means it's just the hormone by itself, or they can be what we call bound, in which they are attached to a transport protein. So there are some hormones that are just free hormones. They never get attached to transport proteins. And then there are others that exist in both states. So if you look at the little blue triangles over here, you have a free form and a bound form of this type of hormone. So sometimes when you get your medical test results, you'll see different counts for like a total amount of a hormone versus a free amount. So what they're measuring is the total amount is looking at all of the hormone, both free and the hormone that's bound to transport proteins, whereas the test that reports the amount of free is just the part that is not attached to the transport protein. It is the free hormones that bind to receptors. So the proteins that are, or the hormones that are bound to transport proteins actually serve as like a reserve of hormone, so that when this free hormone is used up here, so when that's taken out and used up, one of these transport proteins will let go of its bound hormone to replace the free hormone that was used. So bound proteins allow this reserve of hormone that can stay in the blood supply for several weeks. So how does the signal get turned off? In other words, how is the hormone removed from the blood? So some of the hormone is going to diffuse out of the bloodstream to bind to receptors on target cells, and enzymes in the interstitial fluid around those cells will break those hormones down. Some hormones from the blood are absorbed and broken down by the liver or the kidneys, and then some is broken down by enzymes that actually exist in the blood. So we don't want the signal to stay around forever, but the hormone signal is still going to be a lot more long-lasting than the neural signals. And since negative feedback plays such a large role in the endocrine system, I decided to make this its own section. So with negative feedback, the hormone or a hormone can act to turn off its own production. And this usually is involved in multiple hormone pathways. So let's look at an example pathway up here. So like the hypothalamus might release hypothyroid releasing hormone, which causes the pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which causes the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. And so what happens in a pathway like this is when that final hormone is released, in this case it would be the thyroid hormones, the thyroid hormone goes back to the pituitary and the hypothalamus and tells them to stop making the earlier hormones. So that's what we call negative feedback. So the fact that we have produced thyroid hormones means that final product is going to act to tell the hypothalamus and pituitary, okay, we have enough of this around right now so we can stop production. And this keeps you from having too much of a particular hormone present in your blood, so it allows control over the amount of hormone that's available. And you see this in multiple systems. You see it with the stress hormones and the sex hormones as well, in which the final hormone is actually feeding back to earlier stages to turn off its own production. So that is negative feedback, and that is quite common in the endocrine system. Now we're going to look at some specific organs, starting with the hypothalamus. And as part of our discussion on the hypothalamus, we're also going to describe the hypophyseal portal system. So the hypothalamus is a unique structure that provides a link between the nervous and the endocrine systems. So last semester we talked about how the hypothalamus had many different functions, and one of its functions is to coordinate activity between the nervous and the endocrine systems. So I'm not going to revisit all of its functions. I'm only going to focus now on how it interacts with the endocrine system. So there are three main ways that the hypothalamus integrates these two systems. The first one is that the hypothalamus is an endocrine gland itself, and that's shown in green here. So the hypothalamus actually makes antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and oxytocin, and the neurons shown in green that make those hormones secrete them through the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus also secretes hormones that regulate the pituitary gland. These are called regulatory hormones, and they interact with the pituitary gland via a structure called the hypophyseal portal system that we'll look at in detail next. But that's shown in purple in this image. So you have cells in the hypothalamus that make regulatory hormones which travel through a mini little blood circulation to the anterior pituitary gland, where there are additional endocrine cells in the anterior pituitary gland that will make and release hormones in response to those regulatory hormones secreted by the hypothalamus. And finally, the hypothalamus has autonomic centers that control the sympathetic nervous system output to the adrenal medullae. So we did discuss this a bit last semester about how the hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system. And part of that is the sympathetic preganglionic nerve fibers that travel down to the adrenal medullae, which we talked about last semester as being a modified autonomic ganglion. And so in response to signals traveling along these neurons, the adrenal medullae will release epinephrine and norepinephrine. So typically, blood flows from the heart out to arteries, so arteries go away from the heart. They then, the blood passes into smaller and smaller arteries that then branch into capillaries, and this is where you have exchange actually takes place between the blood vessels and the cells and surrounding tissues. And then once oxygen is taken out of the blood and nutrients is taken out of the blood and waste products are added to the blood, blood returns through a series of veins where it'll go back to the heart. It'll then get pumped to the lungs where it'll be reoxygenated, and then this whole cycle will repeat itself. And so we're not going to talk about this until we get to the cardiovascular system in chapters 19, 20, and 21. But I wanted to introduce this to you so that you could better understand what a portal system is. So what I just showed you is the normal blood flow through most of the structures in your body. But there are a few select areas that have what we call portal systems. And a portal system is when you actually have a link between two different sets of capillaries. So whereas this is the normal condition, a portal system would look like this. You have blood coming out through an artery. It goes through a capillary network. Then it's going to go through a vessel called a portal vessel to a second capillary network, and only then will it return back to the heart through veins. All right, so with the portal system, we have an extra set of capillaries, and then we have vessels that connect those two separate sets of capillaries. So in the human body, we have a handful of portal systems. There is the hypophyseal portal system, which we're going to look at on the next slide. There is the hepatic portal system, which we're going to talk about when we get to the digestive system, the placental portal system that we may have time to talk about at the end of the semester, the renal portal system, which goes through your kidneys, and there's even a small portal system in the two gonads, testes and ovaries. So there's not that many portal systems, but since we're about to look at our first one, I wanted to introduce you to what a portal system actually is. So the hypophyseal portal system is located between the hypothalamus in the brain and the anterior pituitary gland, which hangs down below the hypothalamus and is attached by this little stalk called the infundibulum. So we have a set of capillaries that is at the bottom of the hypothalamus, and then we have portal vessels that travel down through the infundibulum, and a second set of capillaries in the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland. So right now we're ignoring everything going on in the posterior side of the pituitary gland because the portal system is only relevant to the anterior pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus will secrete regulatory hormones and into a capillary network shown here that is located in an area of the hypothalamus called the median eminence. And so the neurons that we're focusing on in this picture are these purple neurons. So these would be the neurons that are releasing regulatory hormones. And as you can see, their synapse is right here over top of the capillaries in the median eminence. So they are releasing the hormones into the median eminence. They will then flow through the portal vessels that are located in the infundibulum down to this capillary network, which is in the anterior pituitary gland. And those regulatory hormones will cause these endocrine cells in the anterior lobe of the pituitary to respond. These cells will either increase or decrease the amount of hormone they secrete based on the signal they get from the hypothalamus. So that is called the hypophyseal portal system. And again, it's a portal system because we have two separate sets of capillaries joined by portal vessels. So the hypothalamus releases hormones in two ways. First, there is direct release from neurons that extend down into the posterior pituitary gland, and those are shown in green in this image. So these are two different nuclei in the hypothalamus we talked about last semester, the supraoptic nuclei and the paraventricular nuclei. These cells up here are going to make hormone, and then they have very long axons that are going to extend all the way down through the infundibulum, all the way to the posterior pituitary, where they are released into just a normal capillary. So we have an artery, capillary, vein, so this is the normal system down here. So this is a direct release of hormones, and the two hormones that the hypothalamus secretes directly into the bloodstream are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, ADH, which is also called vasopressin. And we'll talk about these in the next section when we look at the pituitary. And the second way the hypothalamus releases hormones is by secretion of the regulatory hormones into the hypophyseal portal system that we looked at on the previous slide. So that would be these purple neurons that are secreting hormones up here into the median eminence, which then travel down to the anterior lobe of the pituitary, and then they're going to have effects on the endocrine cells that are actually present in the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So notice that the anterior lobe of the pituitary has endocrine cells, the posterior lobe does not. So the hypothalamus's regulatory hormones fall into two broad categories. There are releasing hormones that stimulate the synthesis and secretion of one or more hormones in the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And then there are inhibiting hormones that prevent the synthesis and secretion of one or more hormones in the anterior lobe of the pituitary. So the major regulatory hormones, I'm going to introduce them here, and then we'll mention them again when we actually look at the response of the cells in the pituitary. There is first the thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH. There's a prolactin releasing hormone and a prolactin inhibiting hormone. There's a growth hormone releasing hormone and a growth hormone inhibiting hormone. There's a gonadotropin releasing hormone, and there is a corticotropin releasing hormone. And so we'll go into more detail with these as we walk through the hormones produced by the pituitary gland. So in this section, we're going to talk about the hormones produced by the pituitary gland, and we're going to break them up into two sections, those produced by the anterior lobe and those produced by the posterior lobe. So as a reminder of the pituitary gland anatomy, the pituitary gland is this small little gland that hangs down on the underside of the brain, and it is attached to the hypothalamus through this little stalk area, which is called the infundibulum. The pituitary has two lobes. The anterior lobe contains endocrine cells that make hormones, and it makes 7 different hormones. And the posterior lobe releases 2 hormones, but those 2 hormones are actually produced by the hypothalamus, and then the neurons extend their axons down to the posterior lobe where the hormones are released. So the anterior lobe is also known as the adenohypophysis, and it's going to get regulatory hormones from the hypophyseal portal system connecting the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary is going to contain endocrine glands that secrete and make their own hormones. The posterior lobe is also called the neurohypophysis, and so hypophysis, by the way, means pituitary. So these are 2 different areas of the pituitary, and a hypophyseal system means a pituitary portal system. The posterior lobe or neurohypophysis receives those direct projections from neurons in the hypothalamus, and it's going to release hormones directly into the bloodstream from those neurons. So you can think of the posterior pituitary being an extension of the neurons that started up in the hypothalamus, and that's why it's called the neurohypophysis. So now we're going to look at the 7 hormones made by the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And just a reminder, the anterior lobe is part of that hypophyseal portal system where the endocrine cells are controlled by those regulatory hormones secreted by the hypothalamus. So the first one is the thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. This is also known as thyrotropin. This hormone is released by the anterior pituitary in response to thyrotropin releasing hormones secreted by the hypothalamus. And TSH is going to target the thyroid's production of thyroid hormones, namely T3 and T4, which we'll talk about in the thyroid section. The next hormone is adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. This one's also known as corticotropin. This one is released in response to corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And adrenocorticotropic hormone targets the adrenal cortex's production of glucocorticoids. And again, we'll talk about that specifically when we get to the adrenal glands. Gonadotropins are a broad term used to describe hormones that target the gonads. The gonads in males are called testes, and the gonads in females are called ovaries. Gonadotropins are released in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And there are 2 major gonadotropins. The first one is follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. In females, FSH causes secretion of estrogen and also the development of follicles into eggs to be released. And in males, FSH causes the cells that house the newly forming sperm to trigger sperm maturation. So in males, it helps with the maturation of the sperm. Luteinizing hormone, or LH. In females, this one is going to encourage the secretion of progesterone and also the process of ovulation, in which an egg is released every month. In males, luteinizing hormone is going to trigger the release of testosterone secretion, or actually more generally androgen secretion. So note that testosterone is a type of androgen, but testosterone is the most common androgen, so usually we just say testosterone. The next anterior pituitary hormone is prolactin. Prolactin is stimulated by prolactin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus and inhibited by prolactin-inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus. Prolactin plays a role in mammary gland development during puberty, as well as the production of milk after you've had a baby. The function of prolactin in males is poorly understood, but they do make prolactin as well. Melanocyte stimulating hormone, or MSH, stimulates the melanocyte production in the skin, and melanocytes are cells in the skin that are responsible for producing the melanin that gives our skin its color. Dopamine inhibits MSH release, and in adults, MSH is normally not released. So pituitary MSH is only secreted during fetal development, in very young children, in pregnant women. That's the one exception to where you'll have MSH released by the pituitary in an adult, and then in some disease conditions. And if you end up with a lot of MSH being secreted, it can make your skin color darker, and that is called hyperpigmentation. And the seventh hormone is growth hormone, which is also called somatotropin. This is released in response to growth hormone releasing hormone by the hypothalamus, and it's inhibiting by growth hormone inhibiting hormone by the hypothalamus. Almost all of the cells in the body respond to growth hormone in some degree or another, but skeletal muscles and chondrocytes, which are cells in cartilage, are particularly sensitive to growth hormone. Growth hormone can increase protein synthesis and cell growth in a wide array of different types of cells. It can also stimulate the stem cell division and the differentiation of new daughter cells in epithelial tissue and connective tissue. It can stimulate the breakdown of triglycerides in adipose tissue, so that is turning the triglycerides back into free fatty acids that the body can use in the mitochondria to make ATP. So this promotes the use of fatty acids, using up the fatty acids to produce ATP, and this is called its glucose sparing effect, because mitochondria has a choice to either use fatty acids or to use glucose when it's making ATP, and so growth hormone is going to tell those mitochondria to prefer to use fatty acids and save the glucose. So that's why it's called a glucose sparing effect. However, growth hormone also stimulates the breakdown of glycogen in the liver, and glycogen is the stored form of glucose. So by breaking down the glycogen, this will actually increase the blood glucose levels, but because it's also simultaneously telling mitochondria to use fatty acids, the glucose levels will stay elevated in the blood because the glucose is not being used, and this is called a diabetogenic effect, because diabetes mellitus is characterized by high blood sugar, as we'll talk about later. And then if we look at the posterior lobe of the pituitary, there are two hormones. And again, remember that with the posterior lobe of the pituitary, we have direct projections of hypothalamic neurons, where the axons are coming down and directly releasing a hormone into capillaries inside the posterior pituitary. So there are two of these. The first one is oxytocin. We know the most about how oxytocin plays a role in labor contractions. So this actually is one of the rare positive feedback loops in which once the uterus starts contracting during labor and delivery, it will cause the release of more oxytocin, which will cause more contractions. Oxytocin also plays a role in milk ejection, and milk ejection is the actual release of the milk from the mammary glands. So prolactin is stimulating the production of the milk, and oxytocin is stimulating the release of the milk. Now we are learning a lot more about oxytocin and the role that it plays in social bonding and sexual activity. We now know that oxytocin levels play a huge role in sexual arousal in both sexes, and levels of oxytocin peak in the brain at orgasm in both sexes. And so we're also learning about how it plays a role in our ability to trust people and form bonds with other people. So it plays a large role in social bonding. The other posterior lobe pituitary hormone is antidiuretic hormone, ADH, also known as vasopressin. The neurons that release ADH are osmoreceptors, so they can actually sense when there are changes in the water and ion balance of the blood. The purpose of ADH, or it's one of its purposes, is to prevent water loss, so it helps the body to hold on to water. So when you take a diuretic, you're actually telling the body to get rid of water, so an antidiuretic hormone will tell your body to hold on to water. Alcohol inhibits ADH release, and this is why when you drink alcohol, you have to go to the bathroom a lot more because your body has lost that signal telling it to hold on to the water. And there is a condition when you totally lose your secretion of ADH that causes a condition called diabetes insipidus. And this is a condition that results in frequent excessive urination. And so you're always thirsty because you're always losing all of this water. And so we'll talk a little bit later about how this differs from diabetes mellitus, but in both cases of diabetes, one of the major symptoms is excessive thirst and urination. We are also learning that vasopressin, or ADH, plays a large role in social functions as well. This was first discovered in a lab here in Georgia in Emory University when they were looking at monogamous versus polygamous voles. So a vole is a little mountain rodent. There's a prairie version and a mountain version. And one of these species of voles is monogamous. They mate for life. And the male and the female both take care of the pups. And in the other species, they're polygamous, which means they get together long enough to have sex. The female gets pregnant, then the male leaves. She raises the babies all by herself. And then the next time the mating season rolls around, they'll both mate with somebody completely different. So the researchers at Emory were curious about the difference between these two species of voles, and they found that there were a lot of differences between the two in the amount of vasopressin and vasopressin receptors. And then when they looked deeper, they also saw differences in their oxytocin and oxytocin receptors. And so this led to a whole new window of opportunity with studying both of these hormones and how they play a role in social connections between humans. And I'll post a couple of articles on D2L if you're interested. There's a lot of ongoing research about how we could target both of these systems to help people with social problems, like with the different autism spectrum disorders. So figure 18.9 and table 18.2 in your textbook can help you summarize and study both the hypothalamic and pituitary hormones. I'm showing the figure here, but I'm not showing the table. But this one is showing you the 3 ways that the hypothalamus affects the endocrine system, as well as all of the different hormones released by the pituitary gland and all of their target organs throughout the body. And then I just want to remind you about the negative feedback, because a lot of the negative feedback works at the level of the hypothalamus and pituitary. So up here at the top in green, we have hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. They go to the anterior pituitary to release this hormone shown in blue. The anterior pituitary hormone then goes out to different glands in the body to cause another hormone release. And this final hormone release is going to feed back and inhibit production of the releasing hormone at the hypothalamus and the hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. And that is what we call the negative feedback. And so you have that a lot with the different hypothalamic pituitary hormone pathways. Now we're going to turn our attention to the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands, and we're going to talk about metabolism and also blood calcium level regulation. So first, a little anatomy. So the thyroid gland is made up of 2 lobes connected by a narrow isthmus, and it sits on the anterior surface of the trachea just below a large cartilage called the thyroid cartilage that makes up our larynx. So the thyroid cartilage is what you feel in the front of your throat that you call your Adam's apple. And so just below that is where your thyroid gland sits. And it can be palpated, meaning that it can be felt with your hands. And the more enlarged it is, the more easily it can be felt or even seen, as we'll talk about a little later. The thyroid gland produces 2 major groups of hormones. The first are the thyroid hormones, which are also known as T3 and T4, and then the thyroid also produces calcitonin. The parathyroid glands are 4 small glands that sit on the posterior surface of the thyroid gland. So you'd have to take the thyroid gland out and turn it around to see the 4 parathyroid glands on the back. And the parathyroid glands make just one hormone, parathyroid hormone, or PTH. So now let's talk about the thyroid hormones, which are T3 and T4. So if we look inside a cross-section of the thyroid gland, you can see that it's made up of these little follicles that are surrounded by a simple cuboidal epithelium. And the cells that make up that simple cuboidal epithelium are called follicle cells. And it's these follicle cells that actually produce the thyroid hormones. T3 is also known as triiodothyronine, and T4 is thyroxine, and we have more T4 than we do T3. So you do need to know a bit about how the thyroid hormones are made within the thyroid gland. So again, we're focusing on these follicle cells that are these little cuboidal cells that surround a cavity called a follicle cavity. So the follicle cells are going to take up iodine ions from capillaries, and once it brings those iodine ions inside the cell, it's going to convert them to iodine atoms. It's then going to take the iodine atoms and it's going to covalently bond or link them to a protein called thyroglobulin. So once the iodine atoms are attached to the thyroglobulin, we have a complex here that actually contains the T3 and T4, and this whole complex is then put into the follicle cavity to be stored until it is needed. So notice the difference between T3 and T4 is the number of iodine atoms. So T3 is going to have 3 iodine atoms per molecule, and T4 is going to have 4. When needed, the thyroglobulin with those iodine atoms attached is removed from the follicle cavity through endocytosis. Lysosomes will then break it down into the T3, T4, and then the other amino acids will go back to make more thyroglobulin. And the T3 and T4 are then released out into the bloodstream. And some of them remain free, and then some of them are bound to transport proteins. So of the T3 and T4 that are secreted, as I mentioned earlier, the majority is T4 or thyroxine. So 90% of what is secreted is going to be T4, with T3 making up the rest. And then the majority of both the T3 and T4, so about 75%, is going to be bound to globulin or albumin transport proteins. So you have this balance between free and bound versions, which allows you to keep quite a bit of a reserve of thyroid hormones in your bloodstream. Thyroid hormone is regulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, which is released from the anterior pituitary. And remember that TSH is released in response to TRH from the hypothalamus. So you have the hypothalamus releasing TRH, makes the anterior pituitary release TSH, which is the trigger for the thyroid cells to release T3 and T4. So TSH is needed for the ion pumps that bring in the iodine ions into the follicle cells. And TSH is needed to release the thyroglobulin with the iodine molecules attached from the follicle cavity to be broken down. So you need TSH both to get the iodine inside the cells and to actually have the release of T4 and T3 into the bloodstream. If you have too much TSH, though, this can cause a condition called goiter, which is a swollen thyroid gland, and if it swells enough, it is easily visible in the front of the neck area. So perpetually high TSH levels will cause the thyroid to enlarge because it continually stimulates the thyroid, and the thyroid is thinking, okay, we're getting the stimulation over and over and over again, so we need to add more follicles, and thus it will actually enlarge in size. The most common cause for goiter is a lack of dietary iodine. If you don't have iodine, you can't make T3 and T4. And if you're not making it, you're not releasing it for it to act in negative feedback to turn off the TSH. So you have a constant presence of TSH, which is going to cause this enlargement. But don't think that the lack of iodine is the only thing that can cause goiter. Anything that can elevate TSH levels can cause a goiter. So even if just like your negative feedback is broken, like maybe you have enough iodine and you're making enough T3 and T4, but the T3 and T4 can't go back to the pituitary to turn off the TSH production, you could still get a goiter. So goiter is related to high TSH levels that are perpetually high. Note that TSH is only required for the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4. Even though calcitonin is also produced by the thyroid gland, TSH has no effect on calcitonin production whatsoever. TSH only regulates the production of T3 and T4. So what do T3 and T4 do? Well, these thyroid hormones affect almost every cell in the body. And if you remember from earlier in the lecture, I mentioned that these are one of those lipid-soluble hormones that can go straight inside the cell, and it can bind to receptors on the mitochondria, and it can cause the mitochondria to increase their ATP production, thereby increasing the overall cellular metabolism. So we call these calorigenic effects because the increased production of ATP means I'm breaking down more glucose and fatty acids, means I'm, quote, burning more calories. So an increase in thyroid hormones will cause an increased cellular metabolism, which will increase your overall basal metabolic rate. So the two disorders that are related to either a lack of thyroid hormone or too much thyroid hormone both involve changes to metabolism that result in most of their symptoms. We'll talk about the symptoms in more detail in the in-class activity, but basically all of the symptoms of hypothyroidism boil down to a slow metabolism. For example, being cold all the time because you're not generating enough body heat, gaining weight even when you go on a diet. All of that can be related to a slowed metabolism. And then on the flip side, hyperthyroidism means you have a faster than normal metabolism. And so some of its symptoms are like you're always hot, or you can't gain weight no matter how much you eat, right? So those are all related to having a faster than normal metabolism. Table 18.3 in your textbook lists specific effects on major organs and organ systems caused by the thyroid hormones. I'm not going to go into this level of detail with this lecture because suffice it to say that all of these ultimately result from an increase in cellular metabolism, and it just depends on which system you're increasing as to what specific effects you get. So the thyroid gland also makes calcitonin. So we talked about the follicles and the follicle cells that make the thyroid hormones. Then there is another type of cell that's located between the follicles, and this shown right here in this image. These are called C cells, and the C cells are the cells that produce calcitonin. Calcitonin is secreted in response to blood calcium levels that rise above 11 milligrams per deciliter. So there is no regulatory hormone from the hypothalamus or pituitary that controls this. This is controlled by your actual blood calcium levels. So when blood calcium levels rise above 11 milligrams per deciliter, these C cells are able to sense that, and they release calcitonin as a result. Calcitonin then acts to lower the blood calcium levels back to the homeostatic range. Blood calcium levels should be between 8.5 and 11 milligrams per deciliter. And we'll go into more detail about how calcitonin lowers blood calcium levels in an upcoming slide. We did cover this in A&P1, and I told my students in A&P1, I said, learn this now, get this in your long-term memory. It's going to come back next semester. So if you did remember this in A&P1 and you put this in your long-term memory, then this is one less thing you have to learn and remember from this chapter. However, if you didn't, if you crammed it and dumped it, then you are going to have to learn it again for this chapter, because we are going to go over the regulation of blood calcium levels again. So parathyroid hormone is produced by the parathyroid glands, and inside the glands there is this rather uniform population of cells called parathyroid cells, and they're the cells that actually produce the parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone is secreted in response to blood calcium levels that drop below 8.5 milligrams per deciliter. And the function of parathyroid hormone is to raise those blood calcium levels back to the normal homeostatic range, which again should be between 8.5 and 11 milligrams per deciliter. And here is the image from your textbook, but I'm going to go into these details on the following slides. So here we are again with calcium homeostasis, and these are actually the same slides I used in my A&P1 class, so hopefully this is just a review for you, but if not, you need to learn it now. So it's very important to keep calcium levels in the blood between 8.5 and 11 milligrams per deciliter. If they go too high or too low, it interferes with muscle function as well as neuron function, which means it can mess up the way your brain works and the way your muscles work, particularly your heart. So you definitely do not want your calcium levels to go too high or too low. So let's first look at when calcium levels rise above normal, so that would be higher than 11 milligrams per deciliter. The thyroid gland will now release calcitonin, and again it's the C cells that are releasing the calcitonin. In the bones, the calcitonin will inhibit osteoclasts, and that means less calcium will be released from the bone because osteoclasts were the cells that would break down bone. And the osteoblast activity is actually unaffected. So if anything, maybe your body is now taking more calcium from the blood and putting it into the bone. Calcitonin is also going to affect the kidney. First, it's going to tell the kidney to excrete extra calcium ions. So it's taking the calcium ions out of the blood where they're too high and moving them to the urine. So the end result here is that we actually have more calcium ions in our urine. And the calcitonin is also telling the kidney to slow its release of a hormone it makes called calcitriol. So it's telling the kidney secrete less calcitriol. Less calcitriol means that the intestines are going to absorb less calcium from your food and drink. So you're getting less calcium absorbed from the food and the drink that you take. So like if you drink a glass of water, when you have less calcitriol around, you are actually absorbing less of the calcium from that glass of milk. So the result of all three of these actions is that calcium levels in the blood will decrease back to normal. So basically, I'm slowing release from the skeleton, maybe even adding it to the bones. I'm slowing my absorption of new calcium ions, and I'm excreting current calcium ions out into my urine. So when calcium levels fall below normal, so when they go below 8.5 milligrams per deciliter, this time we have the parathyroid gland, which releases parathyroid hormone. In the bones, the parathyroid hormone is stimulating the osteoclast. So this is actually telling the cells that break down bone to increase their level of breaking down bone. When they break the bone down, the calcium that was inside the bone is released and added to the blood. So we're actually taking calcium from the bone and putting it into the blood. PTH will tell the kidney to hold on to calcium ions, so it's going to tell the kidney to reabsorb those calcium ions, keeping it in the body instead of releasing it through the urine. So now we're going to notice a decreased calcium loss in our urine. And PTH will tell the kidney to make more hormone called calcitriol. So now the kidney is going to increase its calcitriol production. And the calcitriol is going to tell the intestines that they need to absorb more calcium from your food or drink. So now if you drink a glass of milk, you're going to absorb more of the calcium from that glass of milk. So all three of these functions, so holding on to calcium and not releasing it in the urine, absorbing more calcium in the gut, and releasing calcium from the skeleton, will all act to raise the calcium levels back to what they should be, which is higher than 8.5 milligrams per deciliter. So here is table 18.4 from your textbook, which sums up the thyroid gland and the parathyroid gland. So remember, the thyroid gland has the follicles that make the T3 and T4. These target most cells in the body. They increase the cellular respiration rate, and the release of T3 and T4 is regulated by TSH. Thyroid gland also makes calcitonin with its C cells. Calcitonin targets the kidneys and the bone. It's going to decrease calcium concentrations in the blood, and it is stimulated by raised calcium levels in the blood. And then the parathyroid glands have parathyroid cells that make parathyroid hormone, which again are going to target the bone and the kidneys. Only this time it was stimulated by lower than normal blood calcium levels, and it's going to act to raise the blood calcium levels. In this section, we're going to look at the adrenal glands, and as part of this, we're going to also talk about our stress response, and we're going to compare the fast response to the slow response. So first, a little adrenal gland anatomy. The adrenal glands are pyramid-shaped glands that sit right on the superior surface of each kidney. My non-science friends like to call them kidney hats. If you look inside the adrenal gland, there are two regions. There is this outermost region called the adrenal cortex, and the adrenal cortex can itself be divided into three distinct regions, each one producing a different hormone. Although all of the hormones produced by the cortex can collectively be called corticosteroid hormones, because they're all steroid hormones and they're all made by the cortex, so corticosteroid. Then there is also the internalmost portion called the medulla, and this only makes two hormones, norepinephrine and epinephrine. So now let's look at the adrenal cortex. So as mentioned, the cortex is the outermost area, and it can be divided into three regions. The outermost region closest to the capsule on the outside is called the zona glomerulosa, and this is where you have the production of mineralocorticoids, and aldosterone is the most important mineralocorticoid, so we'll talk more about aldosterone. In general, though, the mineralocorticoids regulate the electrolyte concentrations of your bodily fluids. Specifically, aldosterone conserves sodium and eliminates potassium ions. So, for example, in the kidney, aldosterone would tell the kidney to hang on to your sodium ions and to excrete your potassium ions in the urine. Because an increase in sodium ion retention also indirectly affects where water and fluid goes. So there's an idiom that says salt or water follows salt. So an increase in sodium retention will also indirectly cause water and fluid retention. So aldosterone causes conservation of sodium ions and can indirectly cause an increase in fluid content. So aldosterone specifically is secreted when sodium concentrations drop, when your blood pressure drops, when your blood volume drops, or when you have an increase in your potassium ion concentration. So there are no regulatory hormones from the pituitary or hypothalamus that control the zona glomerulosa. This area of the adrenal cortex monitors the electrolyte concentration and bodily fluids and releases aldosterone and other mineralocorticoids as needed. Aldosterone is also released in response to angiotensin II as part of the renin-angiotensin aldosterone pathway, which will be discussed more when we talk about the kidney. The zona fasciculata is the larger middle area of the adrenal cortex, as shown over here in this image. This is the area where glucocorticoids are produced, and the most common glucocorticoid is called cortisol. Corticosteroid and cortisone are also two common glucocorticoids, but cortisol is going to be your most common. But if you've ever heard of someone getting a cortisone shot, or if you've ever used hydrocortisone cream, for like the shots are usually for inflammation in a particular area of your body, and the cream is usually for like rashes or itchy inflammatory areas of the skin. All of these function to suppress your immune system, which we're going to go into more detail with in just a moment. But that is why people get cortisone shots or use hydrocortisone cream. They are all related compounds. They are all related to our naturally produced glucocorticoids. So glucocorticoids are secreted in response to adrenocorticotropin hormone, which is released by the anterior pituitary gland, and the anterior pituitary gland releases ACTH in response to corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH, released by the hypothalamus. So a way to sum up the actions of the glucocorticoids is to say that they help to mobilize your energy stores to prepare your body to respond to a stressful situation, and they also inhibit your immune response, which again is why you have hydrocortisone creams and people get cortisone injections into their joints and other inflamed areas. And then the innermost layer of the cortex, which is going to be the one that sits right next to the adrenal medulla, is called the zona reticularis. And this area produces androgens, and the primary androgen is called testosterone. These are also secreted in response to ACTH from the anterior pituitary. And in females, this is the only source of androgens that females have, and females have enzymes that will convert these androgens into estrogens. In males, these androgens released by the adrenal gland can play a role early on in puberty before the testes have started producing a lot of testosterone. But once the testes start producing testosterone in males, the androgens produced by the adrenal cortex become negligible. They don't really have much an effect because they are dwarfed by the amount of androgens produced by the testes. So the androgens produced by the adrenal gland are really only of note in females. So the adrenal medulla, as we discussed last semester, is a modified autonomic ganglia, and it has direct innervation by the sympathetic nervous system. So there is going to be a pre-sympathetic neuron that runs from the spinal cord to the adrenal medulla and gives direct input to the cells there. So when the adrenal medulla is stimulated, it will secrete compounds called catecholamines, and this is epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine used to be called adrenaline, and norepinephrine used to be called noradrenaline. So they were named for the adrenal gland which releases them, but they have been since renamed to match their chemical structure. The adrenal medulla produces primarily epinephrine, so 75 to 80% epinephrine, and then the rest would be norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine will bind to alpha and beta receptors on their target organs, and we talked about the difference in these two types of receptors last semester in chapter 16. The overall functions of epinephrine and norepinephrine can be summarized as they help you to mobilize your energy reserves to prepare you for a stressful situation, which means they help to break down glycogen into glucose, and they help to break down your stored fat into fatty acids, and then mitochondria can use both of these to make more ATP. They can also increase your heart rate and the force of contraction of your heart, and they can dilate the bronchioles in your lungs, which is why people carry EpiPens if they have allergies, because during an allergic reaction, the bronchioles close up and the person becomes unable to breathe. And if you inject them with an EpiPen, which is actually injecting them with epinephrine, that causes the bronchioles to dilate so that they don't die from lack of oxygen. So the stress response, I actually used to study stress response and how it related to epileptic seizures. That's what I did in grad school. So I am very interested in the stress response. So I wanted to go into a little bit more detail. Your textbook does talk about it briefly, but not in a way that I really like. So I wanted to cover the two aspects of your stress response myself. So when you are first stressed or you first encounter a stressor, you have this fast, short-acting fight or flight response that is part of your sympathetic nervous system. So the stress will trigger the sympathetic nervous system, which will cause neurons to go straight to the adrenal medulla and cause the adrenal medulla to release norepinephrine and epinephrine. The sympathetic nervous system can also have direct connections to organs like the heart and the lungs and the blood vessels. So the sympathetic nervous system can directly control organs through norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter. Remember, we mentioned earlier in this lecture that if it's released into the blood, we call it a hormone. If it's released in a synapse, we call it a neurotransmitter. So all in all, the norepinephrine and epinephrine are going to go out to your target tissues, where basically they're preparing your body to handle an emergency. So like you'll have an increase in your respiration rate, you'll have an increase in your blood flow, which helps get more blood to your heart, lungs, and your brain. Your digestive system will actually be inhibited, so you're going to shut down your digestion while you take care of the emergency. You're also going to inhibit your immune system because, again, you don't need to be worrying about putting extra energy into your immune system when you're trying to solve an emergency or a crisis. And your reproductive system functions will also be inhibited for the same reasons. So this is the fast, short-acting stress response. So this is what we typically think of when you first get frightened. It's that fight or flight response. Remember that neural responses are fast. We also covered this at the beginning of this lecture. Endocrine responses are slow by comparison. So there is a second part of your stress response called the HPA axis. And because this one is all endocrine, it is slower to kick in, but it lasts much longer. So it's called the HPA axis because it involves the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal cortex. So that's your HPA. So what happens is when you have a stressor, the hypothalamus is going to release corticotropin releasing hormone that's going to go through that hypophyseal portal system. It's going to tell the anterior pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone into the bloodstream. The ACTH is going to diffuse through the bloodstream. When it gets to the adrenal cortex, it's going to tell that reticulus fasciculata to release glucocorticoids, and the main one here is cortisol. Cortisol is going to have the same effect on the target tissues as the norepinephrine and epinephrine did. Again, the norepinephrine and epinephrine are the super fast, quick responses that happen immediately. The cortisol is going to keep the stress response going for a lot longer. And so it's going to basically keep you primed to handle the stressful situation even when the norepinephrine and epinephrine have worn off. Cortisol works in a negative feedback manner, so cortisol turns off its own production by inhibiting ACTH production by the anterior pituitary and inhibiting CRH production by the hypothalamus. However, there's a lot of research into the HPA axis because this is the one that is going to be causing all of your problems when you are chronically stressed. So if you have chronic stress and you're always in a stressed situation, your fight or flight system has calmed down, and so you know even when you're like stressed over an exam or a job or a family matter, your heart's not like constantly going, you're not constantly breathing fast, so you're not constantly in this alarm crisis mode, but you still have your HPA axis turned on and you still will have higher levels of cortisol. And with long-term exposure, cortisol can cause all kinds of health problems. For example, because it inhibits the immune system, when you're really stressed, you can be more susceptible to get all kinds of illnesses that your immune system would normally fight away. Cortisol can also disrupt your reproductive system function, make your cycles go crazy. Cortisol actually has effects in the brain where it can affect your mood and make you depressed if it's constantly around. So basically the HPA axis, the slow, longer lasting stress response, is what causes most of the health problems that we do associate with being chronically stressed. So this is how your textbook delivers the same information. They deliver it and call it a general adaptation syndrome, or GAS, and they break it into 3 stages. The stage that they call the alarm stage is the same thing I just described previously as being the sympathetic system activating the adrenal medulla. What they call the resistance phase is the same thing I just described to you as the HPA axis. And then they have a 3rd phase down here called an exhaustion phase, but you're never really going to get to this unless you have depleted all of your reserves. So as this picture shows you here in the middle, you can see this in 3rd world countries where you have severe starvation. So you're so stressed you burn through all of your lipid reserves, all of your glycogen reserves. It can cause your body to actually start undergoing organ failure. But typically in 1st world country like we're in, there's enough sweet and fatty foods around that we can just, when we're chronically stressed, we can keep eating, which can keep fueling our stress response. So we get stuck in this HPA axis phase when we're chronically stressed. And then here is a summary of the adrenal gland. So we have the 3 major regions, the hormones that they produce, as well as the adrenal medulla down here and its hormones, what their target cells are, what their hormonal effects are, and then how they are regulated or controlled. So I encourage you to use this table to help you review when you're studying this section. In this section, we'll talk about the pineal gland, which you should have actually covered last semester as well. And Dr. Sawyer's public service announcement, don't take your melatonin for granted. So the pineal gland is on the posterior side of the brainstem, right above the superior colliculus. And the pineal gland's primary function is to produce melatonin. So melatonin is produced by the pinealocytes, which are these little cells that are within the pineal gland. So melatonin is best known for regulating our circadian rhythms, or our day-night cycles. And it also plays a role in maintaining seasonal rhythms in a lot of other animals, like, for example, animals that hibernate or animals that undergo reproductive capabilities only once or twice a year. Those types of seasonal rhythms are also regulated by melatonin. But we're increasingly understanding more and more about how melatonin also has some powerful protective effects. It is a very potent antioxidant, and it is shown to facilitate repairs throughout our body at night while we're sleeping. And it's brought to light a lot of the dangers involved with the shift work, because people who undergo shift work tend to stay up at night and sleep during the day, and that totally dysregulates and messes up their melatonin cycle. So I'm going to talk about more on that on the next slide, but I also want to talk about melatonin and how it relates to exposure to light at night. So melatonin production is inhibited when you have light that enters your eyes. So as we talked about in chapter 17, part of the light pathway includes light information going to the suprachiasmatic nucleus of the hypothalamus. And the suprachiasmatic nucleus, when it senses light, will actually inhibit melatonin production by the pineal gland. And as I mentioned earlier, we have found that melatonin has all of these beneficial effects for systems all over your body. So, for example, it can help with new bone growth. It can help reduce scar formation and increase Schwann cell regeneration in your peripheral nerve system. It can help reduce oxidative stress in your liver, and it can increase liver levels of antioxidants. You can see it's got benefits for muscle, skin, kidney, bladder. Basically, melatonin just seems to do a whole bunch of good stuff, and we haven't really found out that it does anything bad. But when you expose yourself to light during a period when it would normally be dark, you suppress your melatonin production, and you therefore have less melatonin. So since the advent of electricity, And we can all stay up later at night, and especially now that we all have smart devices. So not only do we stay up at night, but we stay up later looking at phone screens and computer screens and TV screens, all of which suppress our melatonin production. So there is a lot of research that shows that exposure to room light before bedtime can suppress your melatonin onset and shorten your melatonin duration. And, you know, this one study said that these findings indicate that room light exerts a profound suppressive effect on melatonin levels and shortens the body's internal representation of night duration. Chronically exposing oneself to electrical lighting in the late evening disrupts melatonin signaling and could therefore potentially impact sleep, thermoregulation, blood pressure, and glucose homeostasis. So there's a lot to be said about not exposing yourself to too much light at night, and especially not right before you try to go to bed. And I'll post an article about this on D2L if you want to read more. But as I mentioned, there's also dangers involved with shift work. So we have circadian rhythms not only of our melatonin, but also of other hormones, notably cortisol, which we talked about in the previous section. So cortisol actually goes down while we sleep. So during the nighttime, our cortisol levels are low, and then during the day, they peak, and this is to help us prepare for the stress of the day. I mean, any day is going to have some small amount of stress, and we're going to need to be able to, fight the different things that come along during that day, getting up, going to work, being on time, trying to find our car keys, all that types of stuff. So cortisol is normally low at night and highest just after you wake up in the morning. So of course, if you work at night, you're working and exposing yourself to light when you normally would have melatonin. So you're killing that melatonin, and you're working when the cortisol levels would normally be low. And if you're stressed at work, then that's going to keep those cortisol levels up. So it's all going to be totally misaligned. And so there's been a lot of studies that look at if you do shift work, right, you can totally mess up these normal cycles. So normally cortisol is high in the day, low at night. Insulin's normally high in the day, low at night. Growth hormone, melatonin, glucagon, leptin are all normally low during the day and high at night. And so having shift work can throw off multiple endocrine systems. So it can lead to endocrine imbalances and ultimately metabolic disorders like obesity and cardiovascular problems. So there are some professions like nurses and doctors and law enforcement who are always going to have to work shift work just because of the nature of the jobs and the requirements, but there's an increasing push to recognize the dangers of shift work and to compensate people appropriately. So here's another example how shift work and the circadian rhythm misalignment can lead to neurological disorders, mental health problems, metabolic syndromes, gastrointestinal disorders, and even cardiovascular disease. So I'll leave an article about this on D2L as well. In this section, we're going to focus on the pancreas, and we're also going to talk about diabetes. So we'll start with a little anatomy. So the pancreas sits in the curve of the first part of the intestine called the duodenum, and it is retroperitoneal, meaning that it sits behind the peritoneal membrane that lines the abdominal cavity. If we look at the pancreas on the cellular level, it's got two major types of cells. So it has both endocrine function and exocrine function. Remember, endocrine means secretion into extracellular fluid or the blood, and exocrine means secretion onto a duct. So 99% of the pancreas is made up of exocrine cells, and these are called the pancreatic acini, and they're shown up here. Circled, these are the darker colored cells out here. And these types of cells are going to secrete digestive enzymes and buffers that are released into the pancreatic duct, which then carries them into the intestines. And so we're going to discuss that more in the digestive system in chapter 24. The focus for the rest of this section is going to be on the 1% of the pancreas that is composed of endocrine cells. And these are called pancreatic islets, and they're shown within this dotted line up here. They used to be called islet of Langerhans, so you may still see that name hanging around, but now we're just calling them pancreatic islets. It's the endocrine cells in the pancreatic islets that secretes hormones, and so these are going to be the focus of the rest of this section. So the pancreatic islets have 4 types of cells, and each type of cell releases a different type of hormone. So the alpha cells produce glucagon, and glucagon raises blood glucose levels, so it increases the concentration of blood glucose increases the concentration of glucose in your blood. Beta cells produce insulin. Insulin lowers blood glucose levels, so it will decrease the concentration of glucose in the blood. Delta cells produce what's called growth hormone inhibiting hormone, or GHIH. It's actually the same hormone produced by the hypothalamus. And inside the pancreas, the GHIH suppresses the glucagon and insulin release by the alpha and beta cells. And then there are also pancreatic polypeptide cells, or PP cells. These produce pancreatic polypeptide, or PP, and PP inhibits the gallbladder and regulates production of the pancreatic digestive enzymes. So for the rest of this section, we're going to focus on the actions of glucagon and insulin, because we're going to focus on the regulation of blood glucose levels. So just like with calcium, there is a homeostatic range of normal blood glucose levels. So glucose levels in your blood should be between 70 and 110 milligrams per deciliter when you haven't eaten recently. So this is why when they take your blood to measure your glucose levels, they usually ask you to fast beforehand or not to eat for several hours, because this is the normal range of what we call fasting blood glucose. Right after you eat a meal, and especially if you eat a meal that is high in carbohydrates, you'll see a spike in your blood glucose levels as your body absorbs the glucose from the food you ate. And that is why we typically measure the homeostatic level at fasting, because it can vary so much right after you eat. All right, but let's see what happens when levels rise above or below this homeostatic range. So we'll start with blood glucose levels increasing. All right, so if blood glucose levels rise above 110 milligrams per deciliter, this is going to stimulate the beta cells in the pancreatic islets to release insulin. Insulin affects pretty much all of your body cells, and insulin is going to cause your body cells to increase the rate of glucose transport inside the cell. So the cells are taking the glucose out of the blood and moving it inside the cells. It'll increase the rate of glucose use in the cells and ATP generation. So mitochondria are going to use that glucose to make ATP. It will also increase the conversion of glucose to glycogen. Glycogen is the stored form of glucose. So like our skeletal muscles and liver in particular can store a lot of glycogen. It'll also increase amino acid absorption and protein synthesis. This will all use up ATP that it's making from converting the glucose into ATP. And it'll increase the triglyceride or fat synthesis in adipose tissue. So if you have, extra glucose from eating a lot of sweet foods, you're going to increase your production of triglycerides, which is going to be stored as fat. So in all of these cases, what we are doing, what insulin is ultimately doing, is insulin is resulting in the glucose being taken out of the blood and used by cells to make ATP and proteins and glycogen, or to be put into storage, such as glycogen or adipose tissue. But the bottom line is we're taking the glucose out of the blood, so blood glucose levels go back to being normal. So remember, we started with an increase in blood glucose levels, and everything insulin does is to lower blood glucose levels. Now let's look at the other side. If our blood glucose levels drop below 70 milligrams per deciliter, the alpha cells of the pancreatic islets will secrete glucagon. Glucagon is going to primarily affect the liver, skeletal muscle, and adipose cells, so basically everywhere you have stored glycogen or fat. And glucagon is going to say, okay, break that glycogen down back into glucose and put it into the blood. And that's going to happen in liver and skeletal muscle. It's going to say break down the fat we stored and turn it back to fatty acids and put that in the blood. And that's going to happen in the adipose tissue. And in the liver, it's also going to tell the liver to cobble together glucose from scratch. So it's going to increase the synthesis of glucose by the liver. And again, it'll put it into the blood. So basically, the bottom line is that glucagon is resulting in glucose being taken out of storage and put back into the blood. So the trigger was low blood glucose, and so glucagon is going to increase blood glucose. So you have your levels of insulin and glucagon will vary throughout the day depending on your meal times. So for example, right after you eat a meal, as I mentioned before, you will have a spike in your blood glucose levels, so you're going to release insulin. And insulin's going to take that glucose in the blood, tell the cells to take it up and either use it or store it. And that's going to decrease levels back to normal. And then if it's been a few hours and you haven't eaten in a while and your blood glucose levels start to drop, then that's when glucagon is going to kick in and say, hey, let's pull from our storage and use our storage to get glucose back into the blood. So diabetes mellitus is a condition caused by elevated blood glucose. And this is the only time that glucose appears in urine. So one of the first indicators that you have diabetes mellitus is when they test your urine to see if it contains sugar. I also want to point out that a lot of times people will just call this diabetes, but as we're going to see in a moment, there are actually two types of diabetes. So if you're ever doing fill in the blank for this class, you need to be specific and include both words and call it diabetes mellitus. Right, make sure you get that mellitus part on there because we're going to talk about diabetes insipidus in another few moments. So for the diabetes mellitus, which is the elevated blood glucose, there are two types. With type 1 diabetes, which used to be called juvenile diabetes, this is also known as insulin-dependent diabetes, and this is only about 5% of all of the diabetes mellitus cases. So it's responsible for the least amount of diabetes mellitus. But with type 1, the beta cells are unable to produce insulin. So either a person is born with a mutation in their beta cells so they can't make insulin, or the beta cells get destroyed through like an autoimmune reaction where the body attacks the beta cells and destroys them. And either way, the person can no longer make their own insulin. So they are dependent on getting insulin from somewhere else. So what happens in this case? So insulin is a signal. Remember, we just said that insulin was a signal to tell cells to take the blood glucose out of the blood and bring it inside the cell. So what we have here is we have an insulin receptor, and when the insulin binds to the insulin receptor, that is a signal for glucose transporters to take the glucose from the blood and bring it into the cell where the mitochondria can use it to make ATP or where it can be stored. So if you don't have any insulin, the cells can't get the signal, so the glucose stays in the blood. So the blood levels of glucose remain elevated. So that is type 1, and it can be treated by giving a person insulin injections, because the person is not making insulin, so they can then just inject insulin and replace the insulin function with the injection. The other type of diabetes mellitus is called type 2. This is responsible for 95% of the diabetes mellitus cases. And unfortunately, this one is called insulin resistance, and it's also called insulin independent because you actually have enough insulin in your body. So insulin's not the problem. It's your body is no longer responding to the insulin. So it's insulin resistance. So in type 2 diabetes, we have insulin. Insulin's binding to the receptors. But things have changed inside the cells so that the signal of insulin binding to the receptors, the signal is being ignored by the cells. So the cells no longer get that signal, so they no longer add those glucose transporters to bring glucose from the blood into the cell. So this one is more difficult to treat because the problem is not that we don't have insulin. The problem is that the cells are ignoring the insulin signal. And type 2 is thought to be part of a broader metabolic disorder that is brought on by unhealthy eating habits, high sugar intake, obesity, lack of physical exercise. So there's a whole host of things that can cascade to cause type 2 diabetes mellitus. Initial treatment can actually include weight loss and exercise. If you catch it early enough, that might be all that you need. But as it progresses and the body gets further down the diabetes type 2 pathway, there are other medications that you can take. But again, the problem in here is not that you don't have enough insulin, but the cells are no longer listening to the insulin signal. And so there are a lot more of the type 2 diabetes mellitus cases because, unfortunately, we have an abundance of unhealthy foods, a lot of sugary drinks. We're eating more sugar and fat than we ever have before. We've got a lot more people obese than we've ever had before. And so this combination of lack of exercise, bad diet, and being overweight all combine to result in this metabolic disorder that includes our cells just ignoring the insulin signal. So diabetes mellitus can cause a lot of problems. If it's left untreated, you can end up going blind from diabetic retinopathy. You can end up having kidney failure from diabetic nephropathy. You can have early heart attacks and damage to your heart. You can have peripheral nerve problems called diabetic neuropathies. You can have peripheral tissue damage, especially on your extremities like your feet. If you get wounds on your feet, they can ulcerate and not heal. And basically all of the problems that diabetes mellitus can cause boils down to the tissues and cells undergoing an energy crisis. So even though a person may be overweight, and even though they may have all of this stored energy, the glucose is trapped in the blood. Because the cells are not able to get the glucose to come inside the cells are all essentially starving, and that's what leads to this whole host of problems. It's almost like the cells in your body are starving, even though the food source is right there in the blood, but they can't get it out of the blood to come into the cells. And this is true of both type 1 or type 2 diabetes mellitus. They're both going to cause this whole host of problems because they both involve the blood sugar staying in the blood vessel and not coming into the cells. And again, type 1 diabetes is more easily treated with insulin injections. Type 2 diabetes can be more difficult to treat. So I mentioned earlier that there's another type of diabetes called diabetes insipidus, and this is caused by a lack of antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. Diabetes, the word itself, is Latin for siphon, to pass through. And the reason that both forms of diabetes got this name is because both forms cause increased urination, and because you're peeing all the time, it also makes you thirsty to replace the fluids you're losing. So one of the very first symptoms of either one of these types of diabetes is excessive urination and thirst. In the case of diabetes insipidus, this is caused by a lack of antidiuretic hormone, so there's nothing telling the body to hold on to the water, so any water that you take in is just constantly being flushed right back out. Insipidus actually means tasteless in Latin, and it comes from the fact that the urine produced by people with diabetes insipidus has no taste because it is such a dilute urine. It hardly even tastes like urine normally smells. I mean, it's just basically you're drinking so much and you're just passing the water straight through, so your urine is almost completely water at this point. With diabetes mellitus, which is the type of diabetes most of us is familiar with, this is caused by elevated blood sugar, and mellitus means sweet in Latin, and it got this name because doctors used to taste the urine, and if the urine tasted sweet, they would know you had diabetes mellitus. Because remember, this is the only time that sugar shows up in urine is with diabetes mellitus. And because you have the sugar in the urine, it's because your whole osmotic balance of your body is disrupted because of all that sugar that's stuck in the blood. So again, this is going to cause high blood pressure, which is going to cause an increase in urination, and the increase in urination is going to cause an increase in thirst. So both of these types of diabetes end up causing you to have to pee a lot and drink a lot. But with the insipidus, the urine has no taste. With the mellitus, the urine tastes sweet, because this is a blood glucose problem. And yes, doctors did used to taste urine to diagnose which type of diabetes you had. And if there are any Outlander fans, they had Claire in one episode tasting the urine of one of her patients to diagnose diabetes. And that is actually how they used to do it. So here is a summary of the pancreas hormones. Again, put most of your focus into learning the glucagon from the alpha cells and the insulin from the beta cells, because those are the most important for what we've discussed in this section. And now we'll take a look at the newest endocrine gland on the block, and that is adipose tissue. So for a long time, adipose tissue was just thought to act as energy storage and packaging material to support and cushion other structures in the body, but we now consider adipose tissue, or our fat tissue, to be an endocrine gland. And that is because we know that it produces a hormone called leptin. So leptin is specifically a peptide hormone, and it is produced by adipose tissue. And in fact, current research is now showing that adipose tissue makes more than one kind of hormone. So even since the last time I taught this, I've seen more research out there on things like adiponectin and adipsin. So there are a lot of other hormones that we are now identifying. So future A&P textbooks will probably have a much larger section on adipose tissue than yours does. But for the focus of this section, we'll just look at leptin. So they discovered leptin kind of by accident in a lab, and they noticed that they had a strain of mice, and some of the mice gained a whole lot of weight, and the other mice stayed a normal body weight. And these mice were supposed to be genetically identical, but when they looked more closely, they found that the mice that gained all of the body weight actually had developed a mutation in their leptin gene. So they were unable to produce any leptin, and this led to the mouse form of morbid obesity. So this caused a lot of excitement, and it was like, oh, people who are morbidly obese now will have a cure, right? They must have something wrong with their leptin. Now we'll just be able to inject them with leptin, and we can cure obesity. But unfortunately, as they continued looking into this with humans, they found in the cases of the morbidly obese humans, leptin itself is not the problem, but people have problems with the leptin receptor. So especially in the pathways in the brain that tell you that you're not hungry and you don't need to eat, their receptors are broken. So even though they have a ton of leptin in their blood stream, the cells that can't get the message, because remember, back in the beginning of this lecture, a hormone can only affect a cell if a cell has the receptor. So you can have the hormone, but if the receptor is broken, the cell is never going to get the signal. So now new research is indicating that some forms of obesity are linked to people actually having mutations in their leptin receptor, so they can no longer respond to leptin. So what exactly does leptin do? Leptin is a feedback control for our appetite, and basically it suppresses our appetite. So if you think about it, it makes sense, because leptin is produced by adipose tissue. Adipose tissue means you've eaten enough and you have plenty of stored energy reserves, because you don't make fat tissue unless you're eating more than you need. So you eat more than you need, it gets stored as fat. The fat releases the leptin, which tells the brain, we're good, we're not that hungry, we don't need to eat anymore. And so it suppresses your appetite or decreases your food intake. And this is why if you have a problem with either leptin or the leptin receptors, it can lead to obesity, because the brain is no longer getting a signal saying we have plenty of stored energy reserves, we don't need to keep eating, and instead they feel the drive to continue eating. Also note though, leptin is also required for normal levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is that hormone released by the hypothalamus that affects luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone release by the anterior pituitary gland. And so leptin is required to have a normal menstrual cycle and to have normal levels of fertility. So if women end up having too low of a body fat content, so if they lose too much of their body fat, remember leptin is produced by adipose tissue, which is fat tissue. So if women have too low of a body fat content, they're not making enough leptin, so they're not producing enough gonadotropin releasing hormone, so their menstrual cycle can stop and they can have fertility problems. You'll see this often in female athletes who train and train to the point where they're all lean muscle mass and they have very little body fat left. Oftentimes their menstrual cycles will stop completely and they could have trouble conceiving. And this is probably why women evolved to have more body fat in general than men, because of the connection between leptin, body fat, and normal fertility. And we even see this in the old fertility statues that we've dug up from our ancestors. Most of the fertility goddess statues all show women with lots of adipose tissue, meaning that they're making lots of leptin, meaning they have high fertility. In this section, we'll look at other organs with a secondary endocrine function and then briefly mention endocrine disorders. So your textbook gives you a chart that includes some organs that we don't typically think of as being endocrine organs, yet they actually do produce hormones, so they have a secondary endocrine function. Like there are many hormones produced by your intestines to help coordinate your digestive activities, and we'll talk about those in chapter 24. Your kidneys produce calcitriol, which we talked about in this section. Calcitriol secretion is controlled by the parathyroid hormone, and calcitonin secretion by the thyroid glands and the parathyroid glands. And calcitriol controls the absorption of calcium and phosphate in the intestines. But there are a couple of other hormones the kidneys produce. The kidneys also make erythropoietin, or EPO, which we'll talk about in chapter 19, and renin, which we'll talk about in chapter 26. The heart makes natriuretic peptides, AMP and BMP, which we'll talk about in chapter 20. The thymus makes a whole group of hormones called thymosins, and we'll talk about those in chapter 22. The gonads, it says see the separate table. So we have a separate table for the gonads, the testes, and the ovaries. So notice that both testes and ovaries are both influenced by LH and FSH from the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Sometimes people know what these do in females, but they forget that they actually act in males as well. And we're going to go into more detail in the gonad hormones when we get to chapter 28. So for now, just be familiar with these hormone names and what organs produce them. We'll get details in other chapters as we move through these other systems. And then your textbook also provides a list of some common endocrine disorders. I'm not going to go into that level of detail. I just want to introduce you to some terminology and how we classify endocrine disorders. And then we talked about diabetes mellitus a lot in this lecture, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about hypo and hyperthyroidism in the in-class activity. But other than that, we're not going to go into any other endocrine disorders. If you're on the nursing track, you'll get more of that in your pathophysiology class. So if a hormone is overproduced, we call that hypersecretion, and so that can lead to something like hyperthyroidism when you make too much of the thyroid hormone. Hormone underproduction can be called hyposecretion, and again, that would be like hypothyroidism, where you make too little thyroid hormone. And then we can divide endocrine disorders into primary and secondary. So a primary endocrine disorder is a problem with the endocrine organ itself. So the organ is actually damaged, or you're born with a genetic mutation, or it's an autoimmune disorder where your immune system attacks the organ. But the primary endocrine organ making the hormone is where the problem is at. So one example is with type 1 diabetes mellitus. The problem is actual damage to the beta cells in the pancreas, and they are no longer able to produce insulin. Another example is hypothyroidism due to a lack of iodine in the diet, so you're not making enough thyroid hormone because you don't have enough iodine to make it with. That would be a primary endocrine disorder. A secondary endocrine disorder is where you have a problem with other organs or the target tissues. And the problems with the hypothalamus and pituitary gland are actually lumped into this category as well, because the hypothalamus and pituitary gland influence your other endocrine organs, but oftentimes they are not releasing the final hormone. So an example of a secondary endocrine disorder would be type 2 diabetes mellitus, because we're making insulin just fine, but our target cells are not responding to the hormone signal. So this is a problem with the target tissue. Another example is a type of hypothyroidism called secondary hypothyroidism. And because it's secondary, the problem in this case is not with the actual thyroid gland, but rather it's with a lack of thyroid releasing hormone or thyroid stimulating hormone from either the hypothalamus or the pituitary gland. So in this last section, we're going to look at hormone interactions, because cells hardly ever get just one hormone signal. In reality, cells are exposed to multiple hormones at the same time. So this section is going to describe how they handle these interactions. So there are 4 basic outcomes that cells can run into when they get more than one hormone signal. The first group is called antagonistic effects, and this is when a target tissue or organ gets signals from 2 hormones that are giving opposite instructions. An example of this would be like if a signal came from both insulin and glucagon at the same time. Glucagon is telling cells to raise blood glucose levels, and insulin is telling tissues to lower blood glucose levels. So it is basically getting opposite instructions. The net result will depend on the balance between the 2 hormones. So whichever hormone is in the highest level is going to be the one that's going to have the winning effect, although the overall result is still going to be weaker than if it was just the one hormone alone. So for example, if you have more insulin than glucagon, then you're going to overall lower your blood glucose level, but not as much as if the glucagon wasn't present at all. The second type of outcome is called synergistic effects. An example of this is when you have like growth hormone and glucocorticoids. So both are increasing blood glucose levels by giving a signal for glycogen to be broken down into glucose. So in this case, the 2 hormones are giving the same instruction. And in this case, your net result is going to be greater than just one hormone alone. So you'll have, in this example, you'll have higher blood glucose levels than if the instruction came from just growth hormone or just glucocorticoids. So they sum together, they add together, and that's called a synergistic effect. The third type of effect is called a permissive effect. This occurs when one hormone is required for another hormone to have an effect. For example, with epinephrine and thyroid hormone, epinephrine can increase ATP production by mitochondria, but only if the thyroid hormone is also present. So if one hormone isn't present, the other hormone won't be able to have an effect. They still might have other effects, but in this one example, epinephrine will not cause increased ATP production by mitochondria unless the thyroid hormone is also present. So this is called a permissive effect. And then the last type is an integrative effect. In this example, 2 hormones are producing different effects, but they're complementary to each other. The overall goal is the same. So an example of this is calcitriol and parathyroid hormone. So parathyroid hormone can directly affect bones, and it can directly affect the kidney reabsorption of calcium ions. In all cases, is trying to actually raise blood calcium levels. Calcitriol directly affects intestinal absorption of calcium ions. And so these are 2 very different mechanisms. PTH is acting on bones and the kidney reabsorption. Calcitriol is acting on the intestinal absorption. So they both work together to raise blood calcium levels. So they have a complementary effects. So they have a common goal in mind, but they both have different mechanisms by which they get to that goal, and that is called integrative. That is different from synergistic. And synergistic, the two hormones are given the same command, like break down glycogen into glucose. In this case, it's separate commands, but the end result is the same. And that is the end of chapter 18. So your first exam is going to be chapter 15, 17, and 18. So hopefully you've already started studying, because cramming doesn't work very well in A&P.